Does the mind emerge from the brain? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Let's say you're convinced the mind exists and that it's a distinct thing from the brain, and yet you also believe that physics can account for the existence of all things. How do you reconcile those two beliefs? Well, today we'll talk about a view called Emergentism, especially as espoused by philosopher John Searle. So Searle points out four assumptions that he believes taint the mind-body problem that we should get rid of. The first assumption is that mental and physical denote two mutually exclusive categories. Most people, when they use the word physical, just mean the word material, just mean matter. And when they use the word matter, they're usually meaning something about like what Descartes defined it as, which is just something that extends out into space. Now, the problem with that, Searle points out, is that this would discount certain things in science that we now consider to be matter that just doesn't match up with that definition. So Searle presents a different definition of the word physical. A thing is physical if it meets three criteria. The first is that it's located in space and time. The second, that it's causally explainable by microphysics. In other words, using the physics of the smallest particles, the subatomic particles, and we could describe everything about the thing causally. And third, that it functions causally. And now, when we look at those three criteria, if that's what it means to be physical, well, there's nothing to preclude a mind from being physical. So we could have a mind being real and being physical and being separate from the brain. Of course, it's got to be more to it than that. That's just redefining a word. A second assumption is that there's only one kind of reduction. So what does it mean to say, for example, that a projector is reducible to its parts? Meaning like a movie projector or something like that. Well, when we say that it's reducible to its parts, we mean that it's nothing but its parts. Right? A projector is real, sure, but it's nothing more than a collection of the parts that make it up. But what about the image that it projects? The image is not identical to the projector, and yet the image is physical, and the image is real, but the image is totally dependent for its existence on the projector, and not vice versa, right? The projector doesn't depend on the image for anything. So the first kind of reduction of the projector to its parts we can call ontological reduction. And that's the idea that one thing being reducible to another, the first thing is real, and yet it's nothing more than the other thing. Whereas a second kind of reduction we could call causal reduction. And this would be when one thing is not identical to another, but all the intrinsic facts about that thing are explained by or caused by facts about the other thing. Now think about this. A table is solid, but are the parts of the table solid? And I don't mean the parts like the leg and everything. I mean the subatomic particles that make up the table. Are they solid? No. So how is it that the table is solid then? Or think about water being liquid, right? Are the parts of the water liquid? Is hydrogen liquid? Is oxygen liquid? No. So the whole can have properties that the parts don't have themselves, simply because they're arranged in a particular way. These we'll call emergent properties, novel properties of a system that the parts lack, but which emerge when the system is arranged in a particular way. And of course, Searle is going to say that the mind is like that with the brain. The mind is an emergent property of the brain. When the brain is configured in a particular way, it just emerges. A third assumption is that causation is always between discrete events that are temporally ordered, and the cause always precedes the effect. So, for example, you have somebody, shooting pool and hits the cue ball, and that causes the cue ball to move. The effect is the cue ball moving. The cue ball hits the 8-ball. That causes the 8-ball to move. The effect, the 8-ball moving, and then the 8-ball goes into the hole. So that would be a case of temporally ordered cause and effects. But now think about an emergent property like roundness. The parts of a wheel are not round. The subatomic particles that make up the wheel are not round things. And yet when you arrange them in a particular way, they become round. So roundness would be an emergent property like this. Now, the parts of the tire cause the roundness to exist, right? They cause that to emerge. The roundness is totally dependent upon the parts to exist. And yet, the roundness also can turn around and in some ways cause something about the parts themselves as well. The roundness can cause those parts to start to move, right? Once the roundness causes the tire to move, then the parts are moving. So in addition to the discrete causation that we saw with the cue ball hitting the 8 ball and everything, there's also this non-discrete causation where you have this sort of bottom-up causation of the parts causing the roundness to emerge, and also this top-down kind of causation where the emergent property of roundness causes something about the parts, namely for them to roll in this case. And it would be important for us because this would mean that, the brain would cause the mind to exist, but then the mind can go back and cause things about the brain. So this would make a lot of sense out of stuff like, if you have something like I have anxiety and depression at times, and it seems like that the chemicals cause it sometimes to happen, but then I can make it better or worse by the kinds of thoughts that I have. And so that sounds like the mind is causing the brain to do stuff. Well, if there's this non-discrete causation, then that should make sense. A fourth assumption is that identity is unproblematic, that everything is identical with itself and nothing else. So we could have, for example, object identity, where two objects just are the same thing. So like the morning and the evening star, a long time ago, people didn't know that was the same thing. So you'd say, oh, look, it's the morning star. Hey, there goes the evening star. Well, those two objects were actually identical objects. Or you could have identity of composition, like our projector example. Our projector is identical to the parts that make it up. Well, when we're talking about emergent things can be totally dependent upon the things that cause them without being identical to those things. Okay, so those are the four assumptions that we're to jettison. And from there, Searle also believes in biological naturalism, which is that sensations and thoughts are system-level features of brain processes. So therefore, we can say that those sensations and thoughts are causally reducible to and emergent from the brain. Notice also that conscious states fit Searle's criteria for physicality. They're located in space and time, in other words, the brain. They're causally explainable by microphysics. They're, in other words, reducible to neurophysiological processes, and they have physical effects. There's a downward causation to the brain. So conscious states are not strictly identical to neurophysiological states, but all their powers are just extensions of neurophysiological states. So they're not independent things. So the whole mind-body problem, Searle says, is just a pseudo problem. We could just throw it out. And the only question is, how does the mind work, or how does the brain work? And that's a total job for neuroscience. We don't have to do any more philosophy. That's what Searle thinks. Now, that sounds very attractive to me. To be honest, I find emergentism very attractive. And I think the idea of emergence added to different philosophies can be very helpful. But there is a huge problem, which is just we'll call the problem of emergence, which goes something like this. When any other property of an object emerges, it makes sense how it does so. So, for example, the parts of a tire aren't round, sure, but when you see how they're put together, then it makes sense how roundness emerges, right? There's nothing really mystical about that once you see the structure that they come into. We'll call that kind of emergence structural emergence, or a property like loudness. If you have a huge choir of people singing very softly, it could sound super loud. So the property of loudness would emerge even though, the individual parts don't have that property of loudness, but That's just because of what we'll call quantitative emergence, right? You're adding them all together, and then they come up with this, kind of quantitative emergence. But the mind and the brain are nothing like that, right? The mind doesn't emerge from the brain in any kind of structural way. I mean, if you think about it, we've made tremendous progress in neuroscience. By now, we should have some semblance of an idea of how the mind would emerge from the brain, but there's absolutely nothing, right? And I don't mean like we're getting there. I mean, there's no thing there. Like there's a complete absence of any idea whatsoever, and we should. By this, with this amount of information and with this amount of time that's gone by. The emergence of the mind from the brain isn't even intelligible. See, think about this. What makes the emergence of one thing from another intelligible is that you can describe both things using homogeneous concepts. Concepts, that share something in common. So, when we're talking about the roundness of the tire and the parts, we're talking about a shape, a structure. Right? Or we're talking about the choir and the loudness. We're talking about, volume. So you're at least talking about the same kind of thing. But when you're talking about the mind emerging from the brain, you're talking about what? The shape of the brain and the shape of consciousness? No, there's no shape to consciousness. Unless we're talking in the most metaphoric of senses, and metaphor in science does not explain anything. Or another one, electrons in motion versus a first-person experience of red. In what way are those conceptually homogeneous? Those aren't talking about, in any sense, the same kinds of things. So how does it make sense to say that one thing emerges from another in that case? And one possibility here is to say that this is just a case of brute emergence. And when you use the word brute in philosophy, you mean that there's just no explanation for it, can be no explanation for this thing. But we can't say that emergence is brute, because when you say one thing emerges from another thing, what you're saying is there's something in that thing that is causally sufficient to bring about the emergence of that second thing. But whatever it is that's causally sufficient, that's your explanation right there. So there's going to be some explanation when you're talking emergence. The question is just, what is that explanation? And when we talk about the mind-body problem, it doesn't seem like there is any explanation. Although I will say, I've said before that I'm a hylomorphist. So I think like hylomorphism makes sense of emergence. So that in a future video, I'll talk about that and why that is. In any case, if you have any questions about emergence, please hit me up in the comments. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel, really helps me to get this stuff out. And I will see you guys in the next video. Adios.